If you've ever lifted something with the form of a wounded giraffe or welded upside down in a channel like a raccoon under a dumpster, good news, I have a solution. This is an overhead lift, and I'm going to show you how I built it, what I used to build it, how much it cost, how you can make one as well, and most importantly, if you should buy one or build one. Hello, fabricators and fabricatettes. How goes it? And welcome to the show. This is the disclaimer. I am not a structural engineer. I cannot certify anything. I do not have a stamp, a license, or even handwriting good enough to fake one. Use common sense. Build at your own risk. And never, under any circumstances, get under a suspended load. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's just 4 uprights and some cross members. My toddler could draw that with a broken crown. But hang on. What material are you going to use? How do you build an overhead lift without already having one? How much money are you going to spend? What if you want to move it later? Is it better to build one or is it better to buy one? That's exactly what we're going to break down today. Cue the dramatic music. Actually, no, I do not have the budget for that. If you're here for the total cost, you can skip ahead to this timestamp over here. For everyone else, I'll keep a cost counter up here in this corner, starting now. Let's start simple. I chose steel. Why? Because it's strong, available everywhere, and doesn't cost you a firstborn child to go pick up. But what type of steel you have? Now you need to ask yourself this question. What do you want to lift? What do you need to lift? And the most important part, how bad do you not want to borrow anybody else's lift? In my case, this is going in my garage. So I'm going to be picking up stuff like engines, garage-sized projects, maybe a car or two. I'm just kidding, I'm not going to pick up a car, but that would be pretty cool. I chose a 16 by 26 number WF beam, 10 foot long, weighing 35.2 pounds per foot. Now it's time to do some complicated math. The whole beam at 35.2 pounds a foot, weighing in totally at 352 pounds. The uprights were 3 by 3 by 1/4 inch. The drop I cut off of them, because they were originally 8 foot, gave me 2 2-foot stiffeners. Those totals came to 92.64 pounds. The runners are 2 by 4 by 1/4 inch steel tubing. Both of them are 4 foot, which gave me 8 foot total, weighing in at 50.56 pounds. And the stiffeners that are 3 by 2 by 12 gauge stiffeners add 12 pounds total. The grand total coming in to 507 pounds. And yes, trust me, that number will matter later. Brace yourself, because this part gets a little bit dry. I started by cutting, prepping, and beveling all the material on pipe stand. Square tubing is basically just pipe, but without the education. After I cut the I-beam, I used pipe wrenches to slide it around and get into position. Once in place, I gave it a few test jerks to see how it wanted to move. Then, moving my pipe stands into position, I deadlifted one side, then went to the other side and deadlifted that side. You do not need to use pipe stands for this. You can use blocks, sawhorses, a flatbed trailer if you've got one, even the ground. Whatever works, use what you've got. With the beam up on pipe stands, I leveled the beam. After leveling the legs, I roughly squared them off and put a single tack right dead center on top. And remember, you only want one because you want to be able to move it if you have to. Then, just to be sure, I pulled a corner to corner to check my overall squareness by measuring from the corner of the I-beam to the corner of the legs. I'm glad I did this because it was off by a whole inch. So I walked in slowly with making small adjustments a lot until I got it within a 1/16 of an inch. A 1/16 of an inch is good enough for me. Then I tacked all 4 corners and welded what I could reach. Next came the cross members. The runners, cross members, the things that hold on the casters. I highly recommend installing the casters before welding on the cross members just to avoid welding in odd positions. At this point, you'll probably have to elevate the whole project to weld the runners on. With the casters on and the project elevated, I leveled the uprights one more time and used a jack to adjust the height so that way I could get my runners dead center of my upright. Again, just tack it once so that way you can move it if you have to. At this point, you'll make sure it's plumb, level, square, whatever you gotta do to make sure that thing is straight up and down. To make sure you tack all 4 corners, I welded mine out so that way I could put stiffeners on. The hardest part of the whole build will be next. Once you have the lift upright, you can install the last 2 stiffeners and weld them out. I would wait till the very end to weld all your stiffeners out so that way you don't put a stiffener in, weld it out, and then it draws your uprights and your runners from being square. The same with your beam and runners. I would wait to weld those out until you have the everything where you wanted it and weld it in place. The beam alone weighs 352 pounds. The whole thing weighs 507 pounds. And I don't know about you, but I'm not a national strongman competitor, so power cleaning isn't really an option right here. So how are you going to move this safely? Method 1, you could use power equipment. Maybe you already have your own power equipment. Maybe you have a skid steer or tractor. anything with a hydraulic lift, a cherry picker. You could also use that. This is the rentable, predictable, everybody's go-to option. Method 2 for the DIY MacGyver purist out there. You can use a rope and pulley system. And I know what you're thinking, like, what do you mean by all these methods of lifting? Well, let me tell you about them. I tried both. I installed eye bolts in the rafters, ran 2 ropes and 2 pulleys for each rope. Honestly, it lifted fine. Had no problem with the lifting part. The problem was clearance. The problem being clearance, if you take something square and you tilt it on its outmost corner, then at this point, it's longer than it is here. So when I built mine, I counted it to be 2 inches from the ceiling, which was fine for it being barely passing through to the tipping point and sitting flat on the rollers. But what it wasn't fine for is the eye bolts and the pulleys hanging down approximately 5 to 4 inches. It was just enough for it not to pass the tipping point, not for the center of gravity to fall onto itself. Cue the Ditch Witch SK800. I went down to the local equipment rental place and got a mini skid steer with some forks. And after about 30 minutes of carefully re-rigging and trying not to destroy my garage door opener, I obtained victory. Let's talk about casters and the mistakes that can be made. So I did what some people would do. I impulsively hopped in my truck and drove to the closest hardware store, which in my case was Atwood's. Stood in the caster aisle like a confused NPC for about 10 minutes, and I landed on 4 8x2 steel casters that had a rubber coating. The mistake I made was there was no rating on the price tag, there was no rating on the website, there wasn't a rating on the casters themselves. Which, this isn't a problem, but when you're trying to build something that lifts heavy things, you need some kind of documentation saying, hey, these wheels can hold this much weight. The best thing I had to turn to was the internet. The online research I did told me that other casters and some other sources said that the casters I had got were between 1,500 and 2,500 pounds. Let's play it on the safe side and say 1,500 pounds per caster. Also, another mistake I made was I did not buy locking casters. I didn't buy locking mechanism for the casters. I didn't build anything that locks the casters on my runners. I didn't think far enough ahead. This is especially frustrating because when I went back to Atwood's after some time, going back in the caster aisle to get smaller casters for another project, I realized that they do have locking casters in that size, they just didn't have them in stock. Best thing to do when you make mistakes, 2 Ps. Pull it together and problem solve. So now I made little wedges to go in between the casters and the runners to lock them. I also made little wedges for chocks so it doesn't move back and forth. Luckily, this thing will stop on a pebble like it's hitting the handbrake. And if I ever need to lift something really heavy, enough to make me stop and think, man, that's pretty heavy, what I can do is get 4 bottle jacks, make some mounts, and put them under there and take the weight off the casters completely. Now, when it comes to welding, my philosophy is pretty simple. If it works and it stays within reason, it works. For this build, I'm using TIG welding because it's strong, it's clean, and it's buttery smooth. It also really lets me control the penetration and heat, so that way if you have to, you can turn it down and fill big gaps. The typical thing for garage fabrication though is to use stick welding, which is old reliable. If you go that route, I would grab some 7018 or 8018 rod. You can do it with 6010, I just recommend that you put a lot of weld in. If speed is your priority, a wire fed welder like MIG or flux core is your fastest option. But it's usually a little bit more expensive, costs you more pocket change, and it's a little bit harder to dial in. No matter which process, this part is non-negotiable. Clean your metal. Grind it, lap disc it, wire wheel it, whatever it takes. Dirty metal equals ugly welds and weak structure. If you're going for absolute maximum strength, or you want this thing to be borderline nuclear blast proof, bevel your joints and aim for full penetration weld. The goal is simple. Weld stronger than the steel itself. And honestly, you don't have to weld anything permanently. If you want this crane to come apart later, you can add plate, drill holes, and bolt flanges together instead. Same idea, just modular. At the end of the day, all that matters is you welded, it helded, and it's doing its job. Let's talk about some of the hardware. I chose an I-beam not only for the strength, but also because it lets me use a trolley. This is a 2-ton rated I-beam trolley, which that is not only more rating than I need, but also adds a mobility aspect. I can move the load by rolling the whole thing on the casters, or I can move it left and right with the I-beam trolley. If you add a 2-ton chainfall and some nylon chokers, congratulations, you've unlocked a superpower. You've obtained the power of a forklift with the precision of a shopping cart. cost comparisons, and why I'd still build it again. In reality, I probably could have gone out and bought a gantry crane for the same amount of price that it cost to build this one. And honestly, I'm glad I didn't, and I figured it out so that way you don't have to. I'm pretty sure Northern Tools sells an adjustable gantry crane that is rated for 4,000 pounds that checks all the same boxes on paper that mine does. But if you put them side by side, I think mine would definitely win in a fist fight. That all being said, there's definitely ways you can save money if you're building one on your own. First, used steel. Not used steel, used steel. Look online, check Facebook Marketplace, check Craigslist, use whatever you have at your disposal. I was originally going to use a smaller beam to save money, but I found a guy on Facebook Marketplace that has a demolition company that sells beams that used to hold up buildings. Cheap, straight, and already proven. When I showed up, he asked me what I was building. After I told him I was building a lift for my garage, he threw in these uprights for only like 50 bucks more. And I think that's a steal of a deal. Second, ask your local steel supplier for drops. Small pieces like stiffeners do not need full-length material, and drops can save you a lot of money. Third, tools do not have to be new. If you're missing a certain type of tool, I would check pawn shops and resale stores. It's really difficult to burn up a grinder, even though it can be done. Even if you do burn up a grinder, you go back in there and get another one for $30. That's actually where I got my welder. At the end of the day, yeah, buying a crane might make more sense for some people, but building this one taught me a lot. Let me customize it exactly how I wanted it, and gave me something I could trust that I built myself. And if nothing else, I learned that steel is a lot cheaper after surviving building. Mistakes and what I'd do differently. There are only really two things I would change about this build. First, the stiffeners on the runners. The 4 stiffeners I added are shorter than I'd like, and that comes down to not thinking far enough ahead when ordering the material. If I were doing it again, I'd run those stiffeners from the top of the casters towards the top of the beam, or at least halfway up the uprights. Longer bracing would spread the load better. It would also give me more rigidity to the frame. The second design mistake was the orientation of the runners. I laid them flat to make it easier to put the casters on when I should have made him tall and skinny. That orientation would have given me more stiffness and the same amount of material. Neither of these are a deal breaker, but they are a good lesson learned. Hopefully this video helps you think through how you would build yours, or helps you decide whether buying one makes more sense for you. If you would change anything else about my design, let me know in the comments. Let me know in the comments if you would build one or buy one. I'm genuinely curious how other people would approach this project. And if you found this video useful, hit that like button. If you want to see more builds like this, consider subscribing. Until next time, friends, thanks for stopping by. I got it set where it will track.